You know that gut-wrenching feeling you get when your world starts to collapse, and you can't pinpoint why? That's exactly how I felt the night my 16-year-old daughter, Emma, came into my home office and said she needed to talk. She looked shaken, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "Dad, there's something I saw, and I don't know how to tell you," she began, her voice breaking. I immediately felt my heart race. As a father, I've always prided myself on being able to solve problems for my family, but this was different. I tried to calm her down. "Emma, whatever it is, just tell me. We'll figure it out together." Her eyes filled with tears. "It's Mom, she's not who you think she is." Now let me backtrack for a moment here. My wife, Laura, and I had been married for 18 years. From the outside, we seemed like the perfect suburban family. 2 kids, a nice house, family vacations. Sure, we had our share of arguments like any couple, but nothing to suggest what was about to unravel. Emma hesitated before she said it. "She's been cheating on you, Dad. And I saw it happen." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. "What? Emma, that's a serious thing to say." Her face crumpled as she handed me her phone. I recorded it. I didn't know what else to do. I was so angry, so confused. I thought maybe you wouldn't believe me unless you saw it for yourself. My chest tightened as I took the phone. I didn't want to press play. I already knew my life was about to change forever. What I saw on that screen was worse than anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was who Laura had been with, Samantha, Emma's best friend. I slammed the phone down on my desk, my hands shaking. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Emma wiped her tears. "I only found out 2 days ago. I saw them at the house when you were away on that work trip. I thought it was just, I don't know, some misunderstanding at first. But then I caught them again at Samantha's house. She broke down into sobs. At that moment, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a mockery of everything I had built. My wife hadn't just crossed the line, she had bulldozed through every boundary of trust and decency. I hugged Emma tightly, trying to steady my own emotions for her sake. "Thank you for telling me," I whispered. But deep down, I was already planning my next move. Laura had made a fool of me, and I wasn't about to let that slide. After Emma left my office, I sat there in silence, staring at the walls that once held the memories of a happy family. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Did Laura feel no guilt, no shame? And Samantha, how could someone Emma trusted so deeply be a part of this? But I didn't confront Laura that night. No. Confrontation would give her the upper hand, allow her to twist the narrative. I needed clarity, control, and most importantly, a plan. The next morning, Laura was her usual self. She greeted me with a cheerful, "Good morning, honey," as if nothing had happened. Her voice grated on me now, every word sounding hollow and fake. I responded with a forced smile and went about my routine. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. Meanwhile, I began gathering evidence. I wasn't going to rely on a single video. I installed small, discreet cameras around the house and synced them to a secure app on my phone. I also checked Laura's phone when she left it unattended. Sure enough, there were countless messages between her and Samantha. Some were flirty, others more explicit, but all of them made my stomach churn. That week, I played the perfect husband. I cooked dinner, asked about her day, and even planned a date night. It wasn't easy to stomach, but I needed her to feel safe, unsuspecting. The more she believed everything was fine, the more careless she became. Emma, however, was struggling. She avoided Laura at all costs, retreating to her room or spending hours at the library. It hurt me to see her like this, but I assured her that I was handling it. "Trust me," I told her one evening. "I'll make this right." By the weekend, I had enough proof to act. But instead of confronting Laura, I decided to escalate my plan. Revenge wasn't just about making her pay, It was about dismantling the life she'd built while pretending to love me. Step by step, I was going to take everything from her. First, I called my lawyer. I'd known Jack for years, and he owed me a few favors. I didn't go into all the details, but I told him enough. I want to start preparing for divorce proceedings, I said. But it has to be airtight. I don't want her walking away with a dime more than she deserves. Jack agreed, and we began drafting the paperwork. He warned me that things could get ugly, but I was ready for that. In fact, I was counting on it. Next, I reached out to Samantha's parents. They were kind people, always supportive of Emma and her friendship with Samantha. I hated dragging them into this, but they needed to know the truth. I forwarded them some of the messages and videos, keeping my tone as calm as possible. I thought you should be aware of what's been happening, I wrote. The fallout from that conversation was immediate. Samantha's parents were furious, both with her and Laura. They promised to address the situation with their daughter, and though they didn't say it outright, I could tell their opinion of Laura had soured. By the end of the week, cracks were starting to show in Laura's perfect facade. She became quieter, more withdrawn, as if she sensed something was off. But she didn't confront me, and I didn't confront her. Not yet. The stage was set. I had the evidence, the legal groundwork, and the moral high ground. Now, it was time to push her over the edge. By the following week, the tension in the house was palpable. Laura must have noticed something was wrong because she started acting strangely. She was more attentive, asking me about my day and suggesting we plan a family weekend together. I played along, pretending to buy into her sudden interest in reconnecting. What she didn't realize was that I had already set the wheels in motion. The first sign that things were falling apart came when Samantha's parents confronted her. Emma told me about it later that night. "Dad, Samantha texted me," she said hesitantly. "She said her parents found out everything. She's grounded, and they're threatening to send her to boarding school." "Good," I said flatly, my resolve hardening. Samantha had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. Emma looked conflicted. "I mean, I'm glad she's being held accountable, but it's still hard. She was my best friend, Dad." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know, sweetie. But some people aren't who we think they are. You're better off without her." Meanwhile, Laura was starting to crack under the pressure. One evening, she came into our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, fidgeting with her hands. "You've been distant lately," she said, her voice tentative. "Is everything okay?" I looked up from my book and gave her a small smile. "Just work stress," I lied. "Nothing to worry about." She nodded but didn't seem convinced. "Maybe we should plan a getaway. Just the two of us. It's been so long since we've had quality time together." The audacity of her suggestion made my blood boil, but I kept my composure. "That sounds nice," I said, already planning how to use this against her. The next day, I escalated my plan. I reached out to a close friend of ours, Mark. He and Laura had always been friendly, maybe a little too friendly, in hindsight. I fed him just enough information to pique his curiosity, framing it as concern for Laura's well-being. "She's been acting so strange lately," I said. "I think she might be hiding something." Mark, ever the gossip, couldn't resist digging. Within 48 hours he had spread the news through our social circle that something was amiss in our marriage. Laura, of course, caught wind of this and confronted me in a panic. "Did you tell Mark we're having problems?" she demanded one evening, her voice tinged with desperation. I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Problems? I didn't say anything like that." "Why? What did he say?" Her face turned pale. "Never mind," she muttered, retreating to the kitchen. She was unraveling, just as I'd hoped. But the real blow came later that week when she received a letter from Samantha's parents. They had decided to formally distance themselves from Laura, warning her to stay away from their daughter. Emma told me about it after overhearing Laura's frantic phone call with Samantha. "She's losing it, Dad," Emma said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. She was crying and yelling at Samantha on the phone. I think she knows she's in trouble. That was the turning point. Laura's perfect world was crumbling, and she was grasping at straws to keep it together. But she still didn't know the extent of what I had planned. By the end of the week, the cracks in her facade were too large to ignore. She was jumpy, paranoid, and constantly checking her phone. Meanwhile, I continued to act as if everything was fine, biding my time until the moment was right to deliver the final blow. Laura's paranoia was becoming more evident by the day. She jumped every time her phone buzzed, and I often caught her staring off into space, her mind clearly racing. The mask she wore so well was starting to slip, and she was unraveling faster than I expected. Meanwhile, I made sure to play the part of the supportive, oblivious husband. I planned our date night, as she had suggested, reserving a table at her favorite restaurant. She seemed almost relieved by the gesture, perhaps thinking I was none the wiser to her betrayal. But this wasn't just a dinner date. It was a crucial step in my plan. Before we left the house, I casually mentioned, "Oh, I invited Mark and his wife to join us for dessert. They haven't seen us in a while and thought it would be fun to catch up." Her smile faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered. "Oh, that's great," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. As we sat across from each other at the restaurant, I noticed how hard she was trying to act normal. She complimented the food, laughed at my jokes, and even reached for my hand across the table. It was all so rehearsed, so fake, that it made me sick. Halfway through the meal, I decided to test her. "You know," I said, swirling the wine in my glass, "I've been thinking about taking a week off work. Maybe we could go somewhere remote, just the two of us. No distractions, no phones. What do you think?" Her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, and she quickly shook her head. "Oh, I don't know if that's a good idea right now. Things are so busy with Emma's school and, the house projects." I smiled knowingly. "Of course. We can always plan for later." Her relief was almost palpable, but she didn't realize she had just confirmed my suspicions. She couldn't stand the thought of being away from her phone, or from Samantha. After dinner, Mark and his wife joined us as planned. Over dessert, Mark casually brought up the rumor mill. "So, Laura," he said, his tone light but probing, "there's been a lot of chatter about some drama lately. Everything okay?" Laura stiffened, her smile freezing in place. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight. Mark leaned back in his chair, feigning innocence. "Oh, just some silly gossip. You know how people are. I wouldn't take it too seriously." The color drained from Laura's face, and she barely touched her dessert after that. By the time we got home, she was visibly shaken. That night, as she lay beside me in bed, I heard her quietly texting under the covers. I pretended to be asleep, but I knew exactly what she was doing, trying to salvage whatever scraps of her twisted secret she could. The next day, I made my move. I sent an anonymous email to Laura's employer. The message included screenshots of her explicit texts with Samantha, carefully edited to avoid implicating Emma. Laura worked at a high-profile nonprofit, and her image as a devoted wife and mother was crucial to her position. The information I provided was damning enough to call her integrity into question without crossing any legal lines. I also sent copies of the messages to a few close friends who had been particularly nosy about our relationship. The scandal spread like wildfire, and by the end of the week, Laura's carefully curated reputation was in tatters. She came home from work one evening looking pale and defeated. "I think I'm going to take some time off," she said, barely meeting my eyes. I nodded sympathetically. "That's probably a good idea." But inside, I was already celebrating. The trap was set, and it was only a matter of time before it snapped shut entirely. The day after Laura decided to take some time off, the full weight of her actions began to catch up with her. Her phone rang constantly, but she ignored most of the calls, her face tight with anxiety. I could tell she was trying to keep up appearances, but the cracks in her facade were now impossible to hide. It started with her job. By midweek, Laura was called into a meeting with the board of her nonprofit. When she returned home, her face was ashen, and she avoided me entirely. Later that evening, I overheard her whispering into her phone in the kitchen. "They've put me on indefinite leave," she said, her voice trembling. "They said they need time to investigate the allegations." She didn't say who she was talking to, but I could guess. Samantha, no doubt, trying to strategize how to contain the mess. I couldn't help but smirk at the irony. Two people who had shattered the trust of those closest to them now scrambling to protect themselves. Emma, meanwhile, was flourishing. Without Samantha's toxic influence in her life, she seemed lighter, happier. She threw herself into her schoolwork and even joined a new extracurricular club. I made sure to keep her as far removed from the chaos as possible, reassuring her that everything was under control. One evening, I decided to add another twist to the knife. I invited a few of our mutual friends over for dinner, the same ones who had received the anonymous messages about Laura's affair. I wanted her to face the whispers, the judgment, the barely concealed looks of disappointment. Laura was visibly uncomfortable the entire evening. Every time someone asked her a pointed question about her job or mentioned family values, she would laugh nervously and deflect. By the end of the night, she was practically vibrating with tension. After our guests left, she turned to me, her face pale and drawn. Do you think people are talking about me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I feigned ignorance. "Talking about you? Why would they be doing that?" She opened her mouth to respond but quickly shut it again, clearly realizing she couldn't explain without revealing too much. Instead, she shook her head and retreated to our bedroom. The next day, things escalated even further. Samantha's parents, furious with the damage Laura had caused their family, decided to file a formal complaint against her. They claimed that her actions had directly endangered their daughter's mental health and demanded an apology, as well as financial restitution for therapy sessions. Laura received the legal notice during breakfast. She stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade, her hands shaking as she opened it. When she read the contents, she let out a strangled gasp and dropped it on the table. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning concern. "Nothing," she snapped, grabbing the letter and storming out of the room. But it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of her downfall. That evening, she finally broke. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice quivering. "Oh?" I replied, pretending to be oblivious. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. I've made some mistakes," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Big ones. And I raised a hand to stop her. "Laura, if there's something you need to say, just say it." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Finally, she shook her head. "Never mind." She wasn't ready to confess, and that suited me just fine. I wanted her to stew in her guilt, to feel the weight of her actions crushing her from all sides. As she retreated to the bedroom, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat back, savoring the moment. The fallout had begun, and it was only going to get worse from here. Laura's desperation was now palpable. She was jumpy, distracted, and constantly glued to her phone. Whatever illusion of control she thought she had was slipping away, and I could see the fear in her eyes every time I looked at her. But she was still trying to hold on, clinging to the scraps of her crumbling life. That's when she made her fatal mistake. It was a Friday evening, and I had just returned from picking up Emma after her debate practice. We walked into the house to find Laura pacing in the living room, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. She froze when she saw us and quickly ended the call, shoving her phone into her pocket. "Who was that?" I asked casually, setting my keys on the counter. "No one," she said too quickly, her voice brittle. "Just work stuff." Emma shot me a glance, her expression skeptical. She knew as well as I did that Laura's work stuff was a blatant lie. Later that night, when Laura went to take a shower, I seized my opportunity. I retrieved her phone from the nightstand, using the passcode I had memorized months ago. Sure enough, there were messages from Samantha, desperate, panicked messages about fixing this and staying ahead of the story. But what caught my attention was a new name. Peter. The messages were cryptic, but it was clear that Laura was turning to someone for help, someone who wasn't Samantha. Intrigued, I took screenshots of the conversation and forwarded them to myself. Peter, as it turned out, was a lawyer. Laura had reached out to him in a last-ditch effort to protect herself, asking for advice on how to shield her assets in the event of a divorce. She even hinted at the possibility of trying to shift the blame for her actions onto me, painting herself as a victim in an attempt to garner sympathy. My blood boiled as I read her words, but I didn't let my anger cloud my judgment. If she wanted to play dirty, I was more than prepared to match her. The next morning, I took a detour on my way to work and paid a visit to Peter's office. I didn't storm in or make a scene. Instead, I asked to speak with him privately. When he came out to meet me, I handed him a folder containing all the evidence I had gathered, the texts, the videos, the legal complaint from Samantha's parents. "I thought you might want to know who you're representing," I said calmly. Peter's face went pale as he flipped through the documents. I wasn't aware of any of this," he stammered. "Well, now you are," I replied. "And if you choose to continue working with her, you'll be complicit in everything she's done." He nodded quickly, clearly eager to distance himself from the mess. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." By the time I got home that evening, Laura was already on edge. "Peter hasn't been returning my calls," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "It's like he's disappeared." I shrugged, feigning ignorance. "That's strange. Maybe he's busy?" Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't press the issue. Over the next few days, her world continued to unravel. With Peter out of the picture, she had no one left to turn to. Samantha had been grounded and cut off from communication, and her own social circle had largely turned against her thanks to the rumors I had carefully orchestrated. She was isolated, vulnerable, and completely at my mercy. But I wasn't finished yet. That evening, as Laura sat alone in the living room staring blankly at her laptop, I walked in and dropped a stack of papers on the coffee table. She looked up in confusion, then froze when she saw what they were: divorce papers. Her face crumpled as she looked up at me, tears already streaming down her cheeks. You knew?" she whispered. I nodded, my expression cold. "I've known for a long time, Laura. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences." The moment I handed Laura the divorce papers, the house felt like it had turned into a pressure cooker. Her tears streamed down her face, but I remained cold, unmoving. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the culmination of everything I had carefully orchestrated. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I can explain." I crossed my arms and stared at her. "Explain? Laura, there's nothing to explain. You betrayed me. You betrayed Emma. And you didn't even have the decency to own up to it until you were cornered." Her lips quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might actually confess everything. Instead, she dropped the papers onto the coffee table and stood, her shoulders trembling. "This isn't fair," she snapped, her voice rising. "You've been distant for years. Do you think this is entirely my fault? You pushed me away." I laughed, a cold, bitter sound that cut through the room like a knife. "Oh, so now it's my fault? That's rich, Laura. But go ahead, keep deflecting. It's not going to change anything." She stared at me, her eyes wide and wild, as if she couldn't believe I wasn't caving to her excuses. For years, she had relied on manipulation to get her way, but this time, she was outmatched. Suddenly, Emma appeared in the doorway, her face pale and tense. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cautious. Laura's head snapped toward her. "Emma, please. Your father is blowing this out of proportion. We need to talk as a family." "Stop," Emma interrupted, her voice firm. "I'm not a child, Mom. I know what you did. I saw what you did." Laura's face crumpled, and she reached out to Emma, but Emma stepped back, her expression resolute. "You don't get to play the victim," Emma continued. "You heard Dad. You hurt me. And now you're trying to lie your way out of it? The tension in the room was unbearable. Laura looked from me to Emma, as if searching for some crack in our united front, but there was none. She was cornered, and she knew it. Finally, she dropped into the chair, her head in her hands. I made a mistake, she muttered. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Emma scoffed. A mistake? You didn't accidentally betray your family, Mom. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by Laura's quiet sobs. But then, something snapped inside her. She sat up, her eyes blazing with defiance. Fine, she spat. Yes, I messed up. But don't act like you're all saints. You've both been so perfect, haven't you? Maybe if I'd felt loved. Stop it! I barked, my voice cutting through her tirade. Don't you dare try to turn this around on us. This is your doing, Laura. You made your choices, and now you're going to deal with the consequences. She glared at me, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. She was broken, defeated, and out of excuses. I turned to Emma, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Go to your room, sweetheart. I'll handle this. Emma hesitated, her gaze flickering between us, but finally nodded and left the room. Once she was gone, I turned back to Laura. This is how it's going to go, I said, my voice cold and steady. You're going to sign those papers. You're going to leave this house. And you're going to stay out of our lives. Do you understand? Her lip trembled, but she nodded, her defiance finally giving way to resignation. She knew she had lost. But just when I thought the confrontation was over, Laura dropped a bombshell. There's something you don't know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, crossing my arms. What now? She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and fear. It wasn't just me and Samantha. There's someone else. The room seemed to tilt, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. What are you talking about? I finally managed. Laura hesitated, then looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I've been seeing someone else. For months. It's not just an affair, it's a relationship. The words hit me like a freight train. For all my planning, all my preparation, I hadn't seen this coming. And suddenly, everything I thought I knew about her betrayal was thrown into question. Laura's admission hung in the air like a thundercloud, suffocating and heavy. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Another affair? A full-blown relationship? For all my careful planning and evidence gathering, this was the one thing I hadn't anticipated. Who? I demanded, my voice sharp and cold. Who is it? She hesitated, wringing her hands like a guilty child. You don't know him, she said finally. It doesn't matter. I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing. Oh, it matters. Tell me who he is, Laura. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, It's someone from work, or, well, someone who used to work with me. Her words hit me like a slap. So that's why you've been acting so strange at work. You didn't just ruin your family, you brought this into your professional life too? She flinched but didn't respond. My mind raced, trying to piece together how deep this second betrayal went. Who was this mystery man? How long had they been together? And what else was she hiding? But before I could press further, Laura's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She lunged for it, but I was faster. Snatching it up, I saw a new message pop up on the screen. Peter, we need to talk. It's urgent. I felt a chill run down my spine. Peter? The same lawyer she tried to hire to protect herself? My jaw tightened as I opened the message thread. To my astonishment, the text revealed far more than I expected. Peter wasn't just a lawyer, he was the other man. Their messages were filled with plans for secret meetings, declarations of affection, and even discussions about how they could move forward, once the dust settled. I felt a sick twist in my stomach as I realized the depth of her deceit. Peter, I said, my voice low and dangerous. It's Peter, isn't it? Laura froze, her eyes wide with panic. "You don't understand," she stammered. "It's not like that." "Not like that?" I snapped, holding up her phone. "Then what is it like, Laura? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me about everything." She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, realizing she had no defense. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the living room, broken and defeated. In my office, I pulled out the divorce papers and added a new clause, ensuring that any assets tied to infidelity, including anything involving Peter, would be excluded from the settlement. Laura wasn't just going to lose her family, she was going to lose the financial safety net she had so carefully relied on. The next morning, I decided it was time to confront Peter directly. I tracked down his office address and paid him an unannounced visit. He was visibly startled to see me, and the color drained from his face when I placed Laura's phone on his desk. "I know everything," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You've made some interesting choices, Peter. Choices that could cost you more than you realize." He stammered something about not wanting to get involved, but I wasn't there to listen to excuses. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to cut all ties with Laura. No contact, no help, nothing. If I find out you've so much as sent her a text, I'll make sure every detail of this affair becomes public knowledge, starting with your employer." Peter's face turned beet red, and he nodded furiously, agreeing to my terms. It was a small victory, but it was satisfying to see him squirm. When I returned home, Laura was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the divorce papers. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "It's over," I said simply. "Peter's out of the picture. And soon, so will you be." She didn't respond, just nodded numbly. For the first time, she seemed to fully grasp the gravity of what she had done. But I wasn't finished yet. There was one final step in my plan, one last move that would ensure Laura never forgot the consequences of her actions. The silence in the house was deafening in the days that followed my confrontation with Laura and Peter. Laura kept her distance, avoiding me and Emma as much as possible, but I could see the fear and regret in her every movement. She was a shadow of her former self, broken, defeated, and unsure of what would come next. But I wasn't done yet. The final phase of my plan required precision and timing. It wasn't enough for Laura to lose her family, her reputation, and her financial security. I wanted her to face the full weight of her betrayal in the most public, humiliating way possible. I spent the next few days gathering everything I needed, all the evidence of her infidelity, her connections to Peter, and the fallout from Samantha's parents. Then, I compiled it into a digital dossier, a carefully crafted exposé that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. And then I made my move. Laura and I were scheduled to attend a charity gala that weekend. It was a major event in our social circle, and she had been looking forward to it for months. Despite the chaos in her life, she insisted on attending, perhaps hoping it would be an opportunity to salvage her reputation. I played along, pretending to support her decision. The night of the gala, we arrived together, dressed to the nines. Laura plastered on a fake smile and mingled with the other guests, but I could see the tension in her every movement. She was nervous, on edge, as if she sensed that something was coming. And she was right. Halfway through the evening, I excused myself and slipped into the event's control room. I had made arrangements with the AV team earlier in the week, presenting them with what I called a surprise tribute video for Laura. They had no idea what it really contained. As the dinner concluded, the host took to the stage and announced, "And now, a special presentation for one of our most dedicated contributors, Laura." Laura's eyes widened, and she looked at me in confusion. I simply smiled and gestured for her to pay attention. The lights dimmed, and the video began to play. At first, it seemed innocent enough, a montage of photos from past events, accompanied by sentimental music. But then, the tone shifted. Screenshots of her texts with Samantha appeared, followed by clips of the video Emma had recorded. The audience gasped as the messages between her and Peter scrolled across the screen, each one more damning than the last. Laura froze, her face pale as a ghost. Around us, whispers spread like wildfire, guests covering their mouths in shock or glancing at her with disbelief and disgust. The entire room was witnessing the truth of her double life, and there was no escaping it. By the time the video ended, the room was silent. Laura sat motionless, her hands trembling as tears streamed down her face. The host, clearly flustered, tried to regain control of the evening, but the damage was done. Laura's carefully constructed facade had been obliterated in front of everyone who mattered to her. She turned to me, her voice barely a whisper. "How could you?" I leaned in close, my voice calm and steady. "You did this to yourself, Laura. Actions have consequences." Without another word, I stood and walked out of the gala, leaving her to face the fallout alone. The next morning, the video had gone viral. Someone at the gala had recorded it and posted it online, and within hours, it was all over social media. Laura's reputation was in ruins, her name synonymous with betrayal and scandal. By the end of the week, she had moved out of the house, taking only a few belongings with her. Emma and I began to rebuild our lives, free from the toxic presence that had threatened to destroy us. But there was one final twist, something even I hadn't anticipated. After Laura left, the house felt lighter, almost peaceful. Emma and I started to settle into a new routine, finding solace in the quiet stability we'd been missing for so long. The viral video had made Laura a pariah, and she stayed out of sight, likely licking her wounds in some distant corner of her shattered world. I thought the saga was over. I thought I had won. But life, as it turns out, still had one more twist in store for me. A few weeks after Laura's departure, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Samantha's parents. I assumed it was a formal update about their legal complaint against Laura, but as I read the letter, my blood ran cold. The letter detailed something I had never expected, a revelation about Samantha. According to her parents, Samantha had confessed everything, not just about her affair with Laura but about the real reason she had pursued her in the first place. "She told us she did it out of spite," the letter read. "Apparently, she overheard you and Emma talking one evening, and she felt slighted by some comment Emma made about her family. Samantha said she wanted to hurt Emma the way she felt Emma had hurt her. She deliberately targeted Laura, knowing it would cause the most damage." My hands trembled as I set the letter down. The betrayal, as terrible as it had been, wasn't just a result of Laura's selfishness or Samantha's immaturity. It had been a calculated act of malice, a cruel game orchestrated to tear apart my family. But there was more. The letter continued, revealing that Samantha had also been involved with Peter. Apparently, their friendship predated Laura's affair, and it was Samantha who had introduced Laura to him in the first place. Samantha's manipulation had gone deeper than I ever could have imagined, weaving a web of deceit that ensnared everyone around her. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. Everything I thought I knew about what had happened had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion designed to inflict maximum pain. And the worst part? I had unwittingly played right into Samantha's hands, allowing her schemes to devastate Laura, Emma, and me in ways I hadn't even realized. For days I grappled with this new information, unsure of how to proceed. Confronting Samantha would achieve nothing. She was a teenager, shielded by the safety net of her parents and their legal team. Confronting Laura felt equally futile. She was already a shell of her former self, and nothing I could say or do would change what had happened. In the end, I decided to let it go. Samantha's truth, as terrible as it was, didn't change the fact that I had made my decisions based on what I believed at the time. And while the revelation cast a dark shadow over everything, it also gave me a sense of closure. Laura was gone. Samantha was out of our lives. And Emma and I were finally free to move forward. In the months that followed, we rebuilt what had been broken. I focused on being the best father I could be, helping Emma navigate her pain while ensuring she felt loved and supported. Together, we began to heal, finding strength in the bond we shared. And as for Laura? The last I heard, she had moved to another state, far away from the whispers and judgment that followed her like a storm cloud. Whether she ever found peace, I'll never know. But one thing is certain: betrayal, no matter how deeply it cuts, can never break the unshakable bond of family. And in the end, that's what saved us.